Have you ever wondered how certain things are made? Maybe you watched a movie with some incredible effects and wondered how in the world they made it. The special effects looked so realistic, you couldn't help but wonder, what did they create? Cars flipping, things blowing up, fighting sequences, alien invasions, or catastrophic natural disasters. Or maybe you wondered that about a food that you love, like chocolate. If I knew how to make chocolate, then I could potentially be one of the happiest people in the world. Or maybe your favorite thing is pizza, your favorite food, and all you want is to know what they did to make the dough taste so good so you could make it at home. Something else that I'd love to know how it's made would be a jetpack. You might ask why? Why not? I just think it would be interesting to know how it's made. But on the other hand, there are some things that I'm not really super excited about learning how they're made. Things like cheese. I love to eat it. I love cheese from Aldi. That's my favorite place to get cheese, but I don't really want to know anything else about it. Sandals. I've never lost sleep wondering how sandals are made, or roads. I'm so glad that we've got roads to drive on. They get us where we need to go, but I'm not necessarily pumped up about the idea of learning about roadway and the creation process of them. And maybe your list looks different, but no matter what you're curious about, one thing is typically true. The majority of the time it's true. Once you learn how something is made, you understand it better. Let's say that you go to a car plant and you find out how cars are made, or you go to a newspaper plant to find out how the local newspaper is created. Even if you don't have a ton of fun, you still will pay a little more attention the next time that you see a car driving down the road or a newspaper laying on the ground. You just give it a little extra focus because you understand more about how it was made. And for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about the idea of made. It's the title of this series. And our goal is for you to know a little bit more about the idea so that you can better understand it and how it relates to you. So for the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about how babies are made. I'm kidding. Sort of. Hopefully you already know the basics of how babies are made. And if not, then this may be a surprise to you, but babies come from, just the best way to say it is, we're going to be talking about sex, right? That's where babies come from, and that's going to be our subject in this series, Made. Now, I'm not stupid, so I know after hearing this that a bunch of you may want to crawl underneath your seat and hide, like, really? Do we have to talk about this right now? And then a few of you are like, finally, something in church that's going to be interesting to talk about, something that applies to me in my life right now. And then some of you like, gross, I don't want an old person, someone that's older than me, talking to me about sex in church. And I could be wrong, but I assume that most of you already know something about this topic because you've been educated by a teacher, a friend, a parent, or an older sibling, a movie, a song, maybe the internet, or maybe you've even had personal experience in your life. So let's not act like I just brought up sex and that it's a topic that none of you have ever thought about, talked about, or heard about. Still, it just feels weird to talk about it in church. And I get that. After all, isn't church a place where you usually go where people would tell you how wrong and evil sex is? Isn't this a place where you hear all about the things that you should stay away from, sex being near the top of that list? And if you feel that way, I get it, but as a favor to me, I'm going to ask you to do just a couple things tonight and throughout this series. First, just relax. This conversation about sex is going to be different than you think, and it's not because it's going to be super graphic, judgmental, or awkward. It's just going to be different. So everybody just take a deep breath. Also, don't assume that you know what we're going to say. Just track with us and listen, please. That's all we're asking. We promise we're not going to make people feel ashamed or grossed out. We just want people to talk about something that's already being talked about in almost every other area of life. So why shouldn't the church get a chance to be in that conversation as well? And with that being said, I still get the idea that talking about sex in church is weird. In fact, maybe you put up your guard as soon as I mention the word because it's so confusing to talk about, especially if you grew up in church. It's like this argument, and there's two different sides. On one hand, many adults will communicate what seems, and it seems like they're saying is, sex is the worst sin that you could ever commit. And then culture, on the other hand, is communicating something else, something different than what adults in the room are communicating. You watch one comedy movie, or you listen to one hip-hop song, and it's like, this isn't even a big deal. Culture communicates that sex is casual. There's nothing special about it. So how can one topic have such extreme and opposite viewpoints? We'll talk about that throughout this series, but to start out today, I simply want to make 2 points. The first is this, that God made sex. He invented it. So if you've ever wanted to have sex, or if you've ever been curious about sex, God's not mad at you or ashamed of you. He understands hormones. I mean, seriously, He made you and He made hormones. So He gets that. But God also made you. And maybe that seems basic, something that you already know, but this is something that we're going to be talking about a lot in this series, because the decisions that you make when it comes to sex are almost always connected to how you see you. And that's why we're starting with this truth. God made you. And in fact, Scripture says it this way. And if you've got a Bible, open up with me to Psalms 139, verse 14. It reads like this. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. That's Psalm 139, verse 14. And I don't want you to skip over this. God did a good job when He made you, and He also did a good job when He invented sex. Which sounds nice, but the idea doesn't make the topic any less awkward or confusing, does it? And what do these two ideas have to do with each other? That's where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. We're going to look at a passage in Scripture in Matthew. So if you've got your Bible, you can turn to Matthew. And it's from one of the most popular speeches that Jesus ever gave, called the Sermon on the Mount. And at this time, Jesus gave this message. He was starting to gain some popularity, and He was teaching some pretty bold and challenging and confusing things. But more than that, people were finding out that Jesus could heal people. So you can imagine the kinds of crowd in town. And so everywhere that Jesus went, crowds would follow Him. And this particular day, Jesus sits down on a hillside and He starts teaching. And He talked about how people should live and how they should treat each other. And like He did with just about anything, Jesus was beginning to flip the script. He was putting people in a position where they had to think about things in a new way, in a new light. So He kept saying things like, you've heard it said, but I say. In other words, I know what you've always been taught about this subject, but I'm about to throw something new your way. And this is what Jesus had to say about sex in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. I'm just going to read the first part of this verse. He said that you have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. And the first part of this verse was important. You have heard it said, that's how Jesus starts this, and people in the crowd would have been familiar with the Ten Commandments, so they would have known commandment number 7, which says, you shall not commit adultery, meaning don't have sex with somebody else's husband or wife. But then Jesus adds something when he said what he said next. You better believe things were shaken up in this moment. And I imagine some people were like, I walked all the way out here to get my arm or my shoulder or maybe a skin disease. I walked all the way out here to get that healed. I didn't show up to hear this adultery speech. But what Jesus added had to do more than just sex. He said this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery, but I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And this was different. To say don't commit adultery is saying don't have sex before you're supposed to with someone you're not supposed to. And that's all about our behavior, our actions, our choices, things that we are doing on the outside. But then Jesus added what we look at and what we think about to the equation. In other words, Jesus expanded the definition of what sex is. Up to this point, most people had a limited view of sex. Sex was an act, a behavior, and it had nothing more. But the problem is that there's more to sex than just that. And it's kind of like this. It's a part of a picture, but you can't see the whole thing. You're missing the bigger picture because you're so focused on one part of it. I'm going to throw this image up here for you guys to see. But the more that you step back and you view all aspects of the image, then the better you'll be able to see what's really going on. You see, and it's that way with sex. When you see it only as an act or a behavior, and you leave out the thoughts that we think and the things that we look out, then you're missing out on something. Now, why would Jesus bring up this issue of our hearts and what we think about and what we talk about and our behavioral decisions like that? Why would he bring something like that up and bring this whole crowd in the Bible for you and I to read on a daily basis? Because Jesus cares about our hearts. This wasn't Jesus' way of saying, you thought God was just mad if you have sex, and I'm telling you that he's not only mad if you have sex, he's also mad for if you even think about it. No, Jesus, this was his way of saying, how you see the world and how you see each other will either make life better or worse for both of you. And I want more for you. Now, maybe you noticed that Jesus talked about looking at a woman lustfully. And that's pretty specific, and maybe that sounds weird because it's not like people don't ever look at a guy lustfully. Of course they do. But there's a reason that he focused on women, especially, specifically women, because in that culture, in that time, where biblical times that we're talking about here, women were treated as property. They were treated as objects. So women existed for men. They could be used and discarded. Their purpose was to have children, preferably boys, so the boys could carry on the family name. Outside of that, women were instructed to stay indoors and to stay out of the way. So when Jesus says this about looking at a woman lustfully, he is making more than a statement about sex or thinking about sex. He's making a statement about how you see other people. He's addressing the way that women should be viewed and treated. He is elevating their worth. And this isn't just a sermon about avoiding sex. This isn't a sermon just about their hearts. It's a sermon about the way that you view and you treat people. See, sex doesn't start with our behavior. It starts with the value that we see in each other. And to our culture today, it's a reminder to guys and to girls alike that others weren't made to be objects. And you know what counts as an object? A Lunchable, a pair of headphones, a t-shirt, a gas station icy, a math workbook. All of these things are objects or products for you to consume. They are made for you to use. And when you're done with them, you can throw them away. And I think that Jesus is saying, hey, people aren't in that category. In other words, objects are meant to be used, but people are meant to be valued. Now think back with me to the first verse that we mentioned from Psalms 139, verse 14. Let me read it to you one more time just in case you forgot of it. God, thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. Remembering that, doesn't it make sense that Jesus would care about the way that we look at each other? We are fearfully and wonderfully made, and looking at someone lustfully, it doesn't honor how they're made. It makes them an object. So, of course, Jesus would talk more about that than just that act of sex, because you are fearfully, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Even our thoughts about other people should reflect that idea. So what does this mean for you? It means that there's a great question to ask yourself when it comes to anything sex related. Am I treating them like a product or a person? Will this make them an object in my mind, or will it honor them? And when you treat someone like an object or a product, it's all about you and what you want. Even if you don't mean to, you're using someone for your own enjoyment. And when you value, it's all about the other person and what's best for their future. For example, when people are talking about someone in the locker room in an inappropriate way and you're tempted to jump in on that conversation, ask yourself this. Am I talking like them about someone that I'd use or someone that I value? When you're tempted to pressure your boyfriend or girlfriend to go further physically, ask yourself, am I using them or am I valuing their future? And when you're tempted to go to some websites where people are allowing themselves to be objectified, ask yourself, am I using this person like a product, or am I valuing them like a person? Because people in those videos and those images, they're also real people too. And when you're tempted to do something sexually with somebody in a way of keeping them interested in you and having a relationship with you, ask yourself, am I using them to get what I want, or am I valuing what they want? When you're tempted to think about someone in a sexual way, ask yourself, am I thinking about them like an object or a person that I value? Again, this isn't about you having to stay away from something that you won't. God didn't make sex just to torture you. God made it specifically for the context of marriage. Because marriage has the most potential for sex to be valuable and not objectifying. And God places huge value on you. And He doesn't want you to be treated like an object. And at the same time, He places huge value on others. He doesn't want them to be treated as objects. He's not out to guilt you or shame you, but to remind you that all of us were made to be more than objects. And when we start seeing each other that way, we'll begin to treat one another that way. And in turn, we'll make better decisions when it comes to sex and relationships. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. And so is everybody else. So view each other as valuable and not as objects. Let's pray together.